Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Diplomatic Enclave. I am your host Omar Khalid. But men and women are two pillars of the society. When they work together, when they work hand in hand, this is when a society develops. In Pakistan, we've had many organizations working for the betterment of these two genders, for gender equality. In the West, we have many organizations, many people, prominent ones that are working for gender equality. We have the honor to have one such person who's here in Pakistan. She's an Australian. She represents the United Nations Women. She's worked with the Australian military. She's worked with different other organizations for gender equality, for female empowerment. Her name is Elizabeth Broderick, and she's our guest in this episode of Diplomatic Enclave. Stay tuned. And welcome back. We are now joined by the Special Advisor to the Executive Director of UN Women globally, a lady who is here on a very short visit, but a lovely person and one who's here to forge relations between Australia and Pakistan, between the United Nations Women and Pakistan. Let me introduce you to all of you. Her name is Elizabeth Broderick. Elizabeth, thank you very much to have joined us, and thank you to have given us the time. You've got a very tight schedule.
Thank you so much, Omar. It's an absolute delight to be with you today talking about gender equality.
Elizabeth, tell us a little bit about yourself. When I was researching you, I saw that you are with the United Nations Women. You've been with the Australian government as well. You've worked with the Defence Ministry. You have doctorate degrees from, I think, 3 different universities, if I'm not wrong. You're a woman of many different faces and many different personalities. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
You're right. I've done a number of things, and also I'm a mother. And of course a daughter, so I have a place in a family as well. But I've had such a wonderful opportunity to work, as you say, with the Australian government. So for 8 years, Omar, I was what Australia calls its Sex Discrimination Commissioner. So essentially, I had responsibility for promoting gender equality in all aspects of Australian society. So I had an incredible role there. I worked closely with Australia's military, with the military commanders. I work closely with the private sector, and also with our major sporting organisations like Cricket Australia and other organisations.
But tell us a little bit, Elizabeth, they are very different organisations, the military or the government or the sports. And in all of those organisations, you've worked for the betterment of women, for gender equality. How are all these organisations different when they treat gender equality?
You're absolutely right, because they seem very disparate, but in fact, what we know from the research is that when men and women can thrive equally in an organisation, whether that's the military or a sporting organisation, that actually lifts the performance of the organisation. So what happens is when you bring women into a very male-dominated environment, or indeed men into a very female-dominated environment, the group dynamics change and everyone lifts. And that's why the strategies that might be developed in the military actually have some application in private sector or sporting organisations. So what I've learned is it's the sharing of what works and what doesn't is what's so important.
And when you talk about what works and what doesn't, do you feel that in the private sector it's different of what aspects of gender discrimination work for the betterment of women rather than in the public sector, or is it more or less the same?
There's a lot of similarities, but in some areas there are differences as well. So what we see in the private sector in Australia, and I think it's right in saying in Pakistan also, is we don't see many women at the top of companies. They're not running companies or necessarily on their boards. And what we know is that some of the strategies that are useful to get women to the more senior levels will also be useful to get them to the more senior levels of government and also into the parliament, because political empowerment of women is so very important.
When you talk of political empowerment, it's interesting that you talk of that. We've had a female prime minister twice elected, Mohtarama Benazir Bhutto. I think she was one of the first ladies to be elected at this level. We've also had, you talked about organizations, we've had one Director General of the State Bank of Pakistan who was a lady as well. So things have changed a bit here in Pakistan as far as women leadership is concerned. But when you visit the different countries, or when you researched other countries of Asia or in Europe, or even in Australia, do you feel change is coming or has come in the last decades?
Yeah, I absolutely feel that change has come. And just when I look back to my grandmother's generation, when I look back to my mother and now mine and my daughter, what I believe is that every generation of women is more empowered than the previous generation. And it is because there's been so many firsts. As you say, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Australia, we've had our first female Prime Minister as well. We're seeing more and more women step up as the CEOs, the leaders of companies. Although I have to say, in Australia, I was looking at the research, and when I looked at it last year, what I can tell you is that we have more men named Peter running companies than we do women, over women. So we've still got a long way to go. So part of me is incredibly optimistic about where we've come to.
All right.
But I still think that unless we continue to be very intentional, we won't see the change that we want to see, and the change that will strengthen our economy, strengthen families and strengthen communities.
When you talk of people being intentional in the need to empower women more and more, why do you feel this hasn't happened in the last 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 decades in the world? I mean, I'm talking generally.
That's right, across the world. So I like to think of the constraints really in 3 categories. Firstly, I think in many nations, including Australia, there are social and what I call cultural norms. If I take it back to Australia, one of the cultural norms that we have is that only women make good carers, point number 1. And also we have what we call the good mother belief. If you were born and educated in Australia, you believe that good mothers are always with their children. It doesn't matter what you're doing then, but as long as you're with your children, you're a good mother. And the trouble is that in the world of work now and the importance of economic independence, in many nations, including Pakistan, we're seeing women coming more and more into the world of work, which helps themselves and helps families. So I think that's the first category. The second category of constraint is that some of the infrastructure that's necessary, and here in Pakistan I'd say about women's safety on the way to work.
Right.
So, transport needs to be safe. There needs to be help with childcare. I mean, the great thing about Pakistan is that with extended families, caring often happens in the family. But if we travel to Australia, that isn't the case necessarily. And if I'm a woman who wants to work, I need to be able to afford formal childcare, and it's expensive. So that's the second constraint. And thirdly, I'd say sometimes in our organisations, there's a culture which is not welcoming of women. It's an environment where women can't thrive equally with men, and I think that's a third reason that women are excluded.
All right. There are 2 important points here. I think I'll take you on those. First is the extended family. The extended family is also one aspect of our social behavior that has changed globally. Wasn't the case maybe 50, 60 years back. The world over has changed slowly and steadily. The West, first of all, and now it's trickling, the effect is trickling to the East. Do you feel that women empowerment is somehow related to that extended family? For example, do you feel that excluding an extended family would increase female empowerment, or do you feel an extended family is somehow progressive towards women empowerment?
I actually think extended family is quite supportive of women's empowerment, and in some senses the ability for the family to know that that woman will be safe if she goes into work, but also that there will be arrangements for the care of her children, because caring is such an important work that we all do any day. And I'm just thinking of my own situation there. I have an identical twin sister and another twin sister, and we live very close, which is very unusual in Australia for 3 sisters to live very close.
Well, that brings me to a very interesting point. I mean, have you ever exchanged personalities as having an identical twin? I mean, sending her to one of the meetings, maybe, I don't know.
It's been fantastic. It's very handy, I have to say, Omar. No, I still remember when we were at school, my parents decided that we would go to different schools. So, and they did that because they thought that competition was destructive on personal relationships. So my sister went in that direction, I went in this direction, and without the teacher's knowledge, we used to dress up in each other's school uniforms and attend each other's schools, which I have to say was pretty scary on the day day.
If you get caught.
If you get caught, really scary. But even now, I just think that kind of extended family that we have, even as I'm away here, my husband, of course, will care for the children, but my 2 children know they have 3 mothers who will be keeping an eye on them, making sure they're doing the right thing, even though I'm over here. So I think women can be engaged in public life and working life in the knowledge that the care arrangements are supported within the extended family.
All right. Elizabeth, one of the points that you've just mentioned also was about the work environment. Now, you've worked with the military and you've worked in the sporting industry. Now, these are 2 industries which are very male dominated, if I'm not wrong, and it's a global phenomenon. It's just not relegated to Asia, it's also in the US and in Europe and Australia. How difficult is it for you to make the men understand in these industries, in these organizations, that women are as equal and as important to men?
You're absolutely right. It is quite difficult, and the reason for that is those organisations are strong. The military is strong, and sporting organisations are strong. They're strong often because they've got a strong male heritage. They're organisations which were built around a male trajectory of life, a male way of being. And indeed, that's what's made them strong in the past. But when I go into those organisations, I have conversations about what will it take to make this strong organisation strong into the future? Is the past way of operating a way of operating which will make the organisation strong in the future? And I think increasingly men see that, well, as women become more and more educated, and in Australia, and it's the same in Pakistan, they're doing very well in tertiary education, then the talent that we need to draw on is both men and women. So if I'm a smart business, a smart sporting organisation or private sector organisation, I want as many women as I can get, provided they're talented and will contribute to my business. So I think what I try to do is help men see that the future may not be exactly the same as the past. There's still very much an equal role for men, but it's when women come in, the dynamics change, and indeed men get a lift as well as women. And not only that, the organisation gets a strong performance benefit.
Of course, that is important, but it does not trickle always in the industry or the organization that where you try to work. I mean, you might see a very quick effect, but in the long term, it's a constant battle to kind of empower the women, to kind of make them understand the importance of women and the importance of gender equality. Tell us a little bit about one of the programs that you're working on is Male Champions of Change. What is all of that all about?
Yeah, you're right, because it is about empowering the women, but it's also about engaging the men. So Male Champions of Change came about probably after I'd been responsible for gender equality for a couple of years, and I started to think, yes, women's collective action has been so important to create change, but actually, by and large, globally, women don't hold the levers of power. I mean, some women do, but not many women. So if we want to create power, the change of power in nations, then we need men taking the message of gender equality to other men. That's what's going to create more gender equal nations. So having had that blinding insight one day sitting at work, I thought, well, if that's the case, I'm going to pick up the phone and ring some of the most powerful men in our nation. And that's what I did. I started, and I still remember the first call I made. It was with a guy who was the head of IBM in our region. And I knew he had twins, a boy and a girl. So I rang him and I talked to him about, the data in Australia. And I said to him, will you use your power and influence, your wisdom and your collective voice to create change for women in this nation so that your daughter has equal opportunity as her twin brother to create a life for herself here? And I think he said to me he was so kind of blown away thinking about the fact that his daughter may never have the same opportunities as her twin brother, that he said, yeah, where do I sign? So once you've signed your first person on, then it's easier to get the second and then the third and whatever. And now we're at a stage, Omar, where we've got 160 of the most powerful men in our nation. So from the military, from sport, from the property sector, from corporate Australia, from government, our most senior bureaucrat, the head of Prime Minister and Cabinet, who come together regularly in smaller groups. So we've got 9 different groups. And they don't just talk about it. They say to me, the time for talking is over. This is about tangible action. And they've developed a whole lot of different strategies which they share not just amongst themselves, but they share out into the broader business community.
Elizabeth, what are the tangible actions, these opportunities that empower women or put the female gender at par with the male? Could you share some of those?
Yeah, the first one is around strong leadership. And so they believe that it's not about fixing the women, it's about changing the system. And so what are some strategies? One that I love, because it costs nothing and everyone can do it, is what I call the panel pledge.
All right.
So I worked out these 160 men speak at about 2,000 conferences and events every year. And when I looked at how well women were represented, only 15% of the presenters were women. So what every man has done now, as they've taken a panel pledge, they say we don't speak at any conferences or on any panels or forums where there aren't women. So if you want me to come and speak at your event, then you need to know that there needs to be women speaking with me. And just that one shift has really lifted the visibility of women in discussions as as diverse as security and aviation and health and education and leadership. Across every topic, we're seeing more and more women's voices because men, powerful men, have said they won't speak unless other women speak with them. I just want to give you one final example there, because one of the sporting men, and football's a very big, in Australia.
That's true. In football, how many women do we see compared to the men? How many coaches, female coaches,
I
do
know.
we see compared to the men?
We're working on that at the minute, and we've got quite a good Matilda's our women's team. But the head of that was speaking at a big lunch for 1,000 the other day, and he agreed to speak because they said there'd be women speaking with him. So when he got to the event, he saw the 4 chairs, and there were 3 men, and the 4th one was for him. So he grabbed the microphone and he said, "Look, I'm so sorry, but we're not going to be able to start this lunch until some women come up onto the stage, because I'm a male champion and I can't speak if there are no women's voices." So some poor young woman from way down the back said, "Oh, I'll speak."
All right. So there's some kind of a representation from the women.
Yeah, and she came, and he told me the conversation was way better because we had a different perspective. Yes. So it's about the richness of a conversation, the range of different perspectives.
And also the equality of the different points of views coming from the men as well as from the women. You talked about the IBM chief head who had a son and had a daughter, and when you talked about his daughter's future, and it made him very excited because he was not that sure about his daughter's future. Do you see that the world over, this unsurety, this doubt about future of the daughters of the world whenever you visit a country or talk to other people in other countries?
It's such a great way to put it, the uncertainty about the future of the daughters of the world. Absolutely, I see it every day. And I just think back in my own life, Omar, I mean, probably one of the greatest gifts that I've ever had is having a father who believed absolutely that I could achieve, that I could have a role in public life as well as deeply in the family. So having the men in my life believe in me made such a difference to the life that I've had. And I see when I connect with men all across the world in different countries, in my own nation, good men who want opportunity for their daughter. They want her to have the opportunity to leave a violent relationship if that's where she finds herself, the opportunity to both work and care. And I think increasingly men saying, yeah, that's what we want for our daughters. And that's what's changing the world. It's so exciting to see.
When you see these perspectives are changing the world, changing the point of views that the men have, do you feel that the men of the world, the normal men, the normal working men, as we say, have a mentality that can be changed quickly, or do you feel that it's going to progressively change?
I think it will take some time, but what gives me such great hope is that there's so many stories of inspiration about where change has happened. And I was really honoured to hear one of those stories today. A young woman who talked about the fact that she had 2 sisters and a number of brothers, and that she had never had the opportunity for education or to be in paid work. And then through a short program that's being run in Pakistan, she not only was able to get some education, but she got a sense that she could actually step up and help her family out by earning as well. And through a process, she was able to, together with her 2 sisters, come into some form of paid work. Initially it was home-based work, stitching, sewing work, but it was a work that gave her a new sense of what she could achieve and who she was, and that she was someone who could make choices about her and her family's life because now she had some income. And she just talked about how that it had changed her life, not just her life, it had changed the family's life. And it was such an empowering story. So yes, it will take time. We're talking about cultural and generational change. It'll take decades. But what keeps me excited and optimistic about the future is that for most countries, every generation of women is just slightly more empowered than the previous one. And that's why I think we are in the long term heading in the right direction. But what I would say is we need to start accelerating the pace of change. And that's why the men's strategy is so very important.
Speaking again of the male champions of change, what do you feel are the different practical actions, the different commitments that have been taken in this context so far?
I think if I looked at private sector leaders, I think one action which has really had impact is to start collecting the data. So start really collecting the numbers about how many women are starting, where they are in the pipeline, and not just keeping that data within the organisation. Because what I see is many organisations collect the data. The ones that make change are the ones that make that data transparent. So they publish it out, because in a sense then the community is holding to them to account as well. So I think accountability and measurement, I think strong leadership, that is having leaders of organisations out there talking about it, and also those people in the middle management. Because often when I come in as a new recruit into an organisation, I'm not looking at the CEO, I'm probably looking a couple of layers up in the middle management. So how those people behave is really important. Are they inclusive of women? Do they make sure there's a harassment-free environment? Do they make sure that women have the same opportunities in line roles, so in the profit and loss roles to develop as men? They're all the things I think that that every one of us, but particularly men involved in private sector, can do to promote and empower women.
When you talk of harassment, that's a very important point that you raised. Harassment is a very global phenomenon that you see, despite it being a Western society or being an Eastern society. It's something that is very global, and it's something that is there. Despite all the actions that a lot of organizations, including yours, have been taken, how can we stem out harassment from the grassroots level, in your point of view?
Such a great question, because it's in every nation. And just to give you an idea, in Australia, 1 in 4 women has been sexually harassed in the last 5 years in the workplace in Australia. And not only that, domestic violence is also an issue. So what can we do? What we know is from the research that we need to work in organisations where there's a zero tolerance and there's strong and visible leadership around that. So the CEO and others are saying we have no tolerance for that. So if it does happen, and then certain consequences happen. So, but the important thing is, we know it happens, but will women step up and tell their stories?
Exactly, that's very important. The women need to be strong.
I know, but the reason, our research shows the reason women don't tell their stories is that they're scared that they will be victimised. Not, as one woman said to me recently, she said, look, Liz, not only would I be the target of the incident, but I would be victimised for bringing it to the attention of management. She'd be seen as a troublemaker. Oh, and what was she wearing anyway? So I think what we need to do is make it safe for women to speak out or to make a complaint. So I know in Pakistan there's some great new legislation as well, the anti-harassment, which is fantastic to see that. So to set a culture where it's safe for women to speak, and then when women do speak out about these issues, the organisation has to investigate it and has to, if it's found to be substantiated, they have to take some strong action, because that's what a zero tolerance environment looks like.
But Elizabeth, zero tolerance is very easy on paper, whether it be in Pakistan or any other country. But when you want to apply it, when you want to put it into action, it kind of, there are people, there are societies that are there to stop it, to kind of not allow it to bloom as it should in society, irrespective of where you are. Do you think it's the male mentality or the general mentality even of women that needs to change? And if it needs to change, what are the main factors that need to be brought in, enforced, so that it changes?
Yeah, you're right, because it is about, I mean, most sexual harassment we see, it is a very gendered thing. It's men sexually harassing women. That's not to say it doesn't sometimes happen the other way around, but predominantly men sexually harassing women. And it's about power. Power and control. So actually anything you do to achieve greater levels of gender equality or gender diversity within the organisation will have a positive impact on limiting sexual harassment. But indeed, I think the most important thing that we can do is tell the stories also of the impact of sexual harassment, because in those environments where harassment is common, women just can't stay. They can't stay, and if they do stay, the mental health impacts are very, very severe. So one of the things I talk to men about also is that sexual harassment just doesn't come out of nowhere. It happens on a continuum, and at this end of a continuum we have demeaning attitudes about women, you know, the unfunny joker, I call it, the person who always wants to make a joke laden with sexual innuendo. In fact, what we need to do is cut off that behaviour right here, because if we let it run along unchecked, it moves to a place of sexual harassment, and then at the other end is, you know, full-on gender-based violence. So this end of a spectrum I call everyday sexism.
All right.
Yeah, so that's, you know, always commenting on a woman's appearance, or, you know, making demeaning comments about her or whatever. Good leaders, whether they're right at the top or in the middle, they don't allow this to happen. They call it out when it happens, and that's what we need. It's courage. It's a really courageous journey, but calling it out here.
But you see, the courage needs to come not only from the women, but also from the men. Speaking of that, male champions of change, it encompasses 8 different groups, around 130 different leaders are there. What do these 8 groups do?
Well, they do a range of things. So one is that every one of them will have looked at the pay equality, so looked at whether they're paying men and women equally. But different groups have different expertise. So we have a Male Champions of Change group in STEM, science, technology, engineering and mathematics. That group, because they've got a Nobel Prize winner in physics and whatever, they've got more PhDs than any other group, I like to say. They're looking at all the metrics. So, and they're really interrogating the metrics, which has been good. But if you look at the group, which is all the fire commissioners, so fire and emergency commissioners, they're looking at the impact of climate change on women, the gendered impact there. So they're devising some strategies there. And then if you look at some of the groups which are quite mixed, so you'll have, you know, command and control, so you'll have police, military, corporate, government, all in the same group. They're working out how can we as leaders of national institutions work together to promote gender equality. So they're all doing different things. What I love now is we've got so many that all the ideas come into the community of practice and everyone learns from each other, so everyone lifts. It's really fun.
This Male Champions of Change program, do you want to extend it to other countries as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And indeed in Japan, as one example, Prime Minister Abe has set up a Male Champions of Change. So they now have 100 Male Champions of Change in Japan, and they've just taken the elements of a strategy and localised it to ensure that it's, you know, really relevant and delivering benefit in Japan. So we're working, we're about to look at establishing a group in Hong Kong. We're working in many different nations, where the nation's just interested in understanding how these things work and what elements might be appropriate to a different country.
You also work with the UN Women. Now, the UN Women is also a very important organization. I talked to his representative in Pakistan more than once, and I was, let's say, enlightened by the different prospects and projects that the UN Women is undertaking. Where does your role come in?
Yeah, my role is as a special advisor to the Undersecretary of UN Women out of New York, and I have quite a defined role. So what I do for her is I bring together the global CEOs. So the global head of Unilever, the global head of McKinsey, Coca-Cola, Ogilvy, Safaricom in Africa. So I convene a group, and it's based on male champions of change principles. Don't tell anyone, but it is.
Right.
So I bring a lot of the thinking and learning and the strategies that we've pioneered. I bring that to bring a group of really powerful global private sector leaders together. They are looking not just within their organisation, they want to step up externally as well. So make sure that the work they're doing has an impact globally. So one of the things they're doing is very much down the supply chain. Because if you take Unilever, they have 5 million small tea plantation farmers in their supply chain, just as one example. They want 50% of those plantation providers to be women, the head of a plantation. And when I talk to them about why that makes sense, it's because the tea plantations that are run by women have much less sexual harassment, and the production's higher. So, in every element, these leaders are really stepping up strongly on gender equality. And what they recognise, in some nations, they are the largest employer in the nation. If they decide to shift, the nation shifts. So they're really exhibiting strong leadership, and my role is to devise a work plan for them, to make sure that all the deep expertise that UN Women has is injected into their strategies, and that together UN Women, in collaboration with private sector organisations, can move forward in the world.
Can you tell us a little bit about your success stories as far as United Nations Women and your role in it is concerned?
Yeah, I suppose really one of the success stories would be the fact that 20 years ago, when all the women of the world came to Beijing and they had what they called the Beijing Platform for Action. So it was thousands and thousands of women coming together to determine what needed to shift. At that time, there was no private sector representation. Private sector wasn't seen to be a key partner. It was about civil society, it was about government, but the private sector was really missing from that picture. So I think 20 years on now, what we've seen is the UN and UN Women particularly engaging very purposefully with the private sector and really recognising that if we want to shift economies, if we want to build strong economies, if we want to empower women, then the world of work and private sector is such an important part of our picture. So I suppose one of the things that I've been able to help UN Women do is how do we engage at the most senior levels of private sector across the world.
All right, and you're so far from the reaction that you've gotten, you're satisfied?
Yeah, well, it continues to be a work in progress, but I have to say it's UN Women have really, they're engaging, and so are the CEOs from the global organisation. So it's an exciting time to be there.
I'll mention one of your quotes. You say that relying exclusively on women to lead change on gender equality is illogical. Why do you say so?
I say it's illogical because what I've learned is that women largely don't hold the levers of power. So we're asking women who are not holding the levers of power to create change in organisations, institutions, in nations and in the world. And indeed, if we want to change, we need to work with those who have power. So as an extension of that, I'm not saying that women's collective voice and activism isn't important, it's critical. Because it's what's got us to where we are today, Omar. And in all our nations, women have the vote, they have the right to hold money and variety. So women's collective action is very important. We need to honour that. But I think to accelerate change, we need to work with those who have power, and that's men.
All right. Do you feel that it's an easy task to kind of ask the male leaders to advocate for gender equality? You've talked about the bit of difficulties you've had, but a lot of positivity that you've received from them as well. But generally, when you kind of look behind, because it's not the first time you're doing it, it won't be certainly be the last. How would you rate the percentage of male leaders reacting or putting words into action as far as gender inequality is concerned?
It's a good point because, you know, everyone can say they support gender equality and then just go back to the old way of doing business. But I think more and more, I think I'm seeing men who they have really strong and good intention to build more gender equal organisations. They just don't know how to do that. So I think the work that not just I, but so many people are doing across the world now is to develop strategies which men can just pick up and then move forward with. So I am very optimistic. Having said that, there are many men who, because they've never worked with women, they have no experience about that, and they come sometimes from a place of fear. So what will it mean, women coming into my organisation? Is that going to mean that I don't have the opportunities that I had before? Is it about me as a man losing out? And I have a lot of conversations with men about that, about loss, about grief, about fear. And for me, what's important is to help men see that, no, actually, let's recognise their contribution to what exists today. Because to be honest, if men hadn't built strong organisations, we wouldn't have the incredible institutions and organisations that we have in the world today. So let's honour that contribution, but let's help men see that the future is probably going to be different from the past, and that every person can contribute. But I like to say to men also, do you want to be part of an organisation where you know categorically that a large proportion of the people in the organisation will never have the same opportunity to thrive that you do? Is that an organisation you're proud to, belong to lead, to call your own? And most men, I think, when they think about it in that way, they don't want to be part of that picture.
That's true, but I feel that fear plays a huge part in disrupting the status quo when it comes to gender equality, whether it be in regions of Asia or in Europe. A lot of people are afraid, what if we give them the same power as ourselves? What will happen? They're afraid of the consequence. It's like you don't know what's going to come ahead. And due to the fear, they kind of don't want to. There's also that male patriarchy, but there are also, I feel fear is one of the factors. Coming to Asia, you're here in Pakistan. You've studied the region of Asia. Do you feel it's easy to disrupt the status quo when it comes to this region?
I think this region, like many other regions, no, it's not easy. This journey is not easy, absolutely, and it's not quick. I used to think it's one giant leap, but what I've learned is no, it's countless intentional steps. Keep on pushing forward, just a little bit, and then back a bit, and then forward. So it's about knowing where you're heading to, believing that aim, what you're aiming for, and for me it's about a gender equal world, so my daughter and my son have the same opportunities, caring about that enough to keep on finding ways to push forward. And enlisting, people, good people who have been so important in the past, but also want to continue to design a different future for not just their children, but let's think about our grandchildren. Let's think a couple of generations down as well. So no, it's not easy, and I don't think it'll be easy in South Asia to move ahead. But is it impossible? Absolutely not. No, and that's what gives me great hope, because there's so many men and women of courage in South Asia. I see it every day. And, while there's men and women of courage, there's stories of hope, there's inspiration. No, absolutely, we can move it forward.
That's a very positive and optimistic approach to gender equality. You're in Pakistan. This is your first visit to Pakistan. Who have you visited till now, and what has been the reaction from their end?
I have to say I've enjoyed every meeting that I've had. So I've worked with I've met with some very senior private sector leaders. I've met with representatives of UN Women, ILO, the World Bank, so some really important global players. I've met with parliamentarians. I spent time with the Women's Parliamentary Caucus, and that was just fantastic to see that the work they're doing in the Parliament. And I've met also with the staff here in our embassy to understand their experiences of working and whatever. So far that's what I've been doing. As I travel around, because I'll travel to Lahore and also Karachi, I'll meet once again with ministers, government officials, but also a lot of private sector leaders, women's groups, other NGOs. So it's a very diverse men and women, young and old. And I think, I mean, even now I'm getting a sense of a really great feel for what's happening in Pakistan. And there's so many bright spots, but just like Australia, you know, progress is uneven. So it requires some further work.
When you advocate gender equality to the business community in Pakistan, you've talked to some of them, time needed, you'll talk to others in other cities of Pakistan as well. Do you feel the future is bright as far as their reaction and their words being put into action is concerned? Yeah,
look, I had some great meetings today, I have to say. I heard about the fact that some of the businesses were running female factory floors, that they had safe transport to and from work, that they were really moving forward with harassment-free environments. And not only that, a number of them had set targets for the number of women at their board and at senior level. I heard from many of them about progress. So one organisation, I think, had 12% and had set a target, you know, to jump higher than that quite quickly. I felt optimistic. I walked away saying, you know, this is terrific. I'm seeing strong leadership. Now, is that every business in Pakistan? I'd probably guess not. It's the same as Australia. I'll meet with some who are very innovative, but is that every business in Australia? No. But what I think is when we get some great examples, some case studies, and if they can be shared very, very widely, because as you said, Omar, it is fear. A lot of people, it's fear of the unknown. What if we have women in this area of our business? We've never had them there before. What would that mean? So I think if we can share the stories of how productive and how constructive that's been, then it may encourage others who are more reluctant to step into this unknown. It may encourage them just to step in a bit, and then everyone will lift.
Elizabeth, a lot of women step into this unknown in Pakistan as well, abroad as well. They become heads of organizations, heads of different communities, heads of businesses. But then the relationship that even being the heads that they have with their juniors might not be the same that a man at the same place would have had with the people under him. Do you feel that also will change with time?
I hope it changes with time as well, because that relationship should be built on dignity and respect, really, whether it's a male or a female. But I know you're right. I see it, you know, where there's a female boss.
Even if you're on top, even if you're the head of an organization, you're a woman. A lot of organizations might accept you as the head, but might not accept all what you're trying to bring to the organization. Again, but that aspect of fear or some other thing, maybe that patriarchy point comes into play as well. Do you feel that will effectively change for the better in the West and in the East?
I think it will, because if you have leaders, and we're talking female leaders here, who are inclusive, so you've got to recognise where the organisation's at, and it's not about revolution, it's about evolution.
True, that's a very important.
So I think that's what's important. So inclusive leaders who've made it, and you've got a first female CEO of a major bank here, and I'm so excited to hear that, because I think just because she's female leader doesn't mean that she'll just be focusing on gender equality. You know, it'll be about leading the bank, so it's the strongest bank.
Not currently, but we've had her before. She's now been replaced by a man, but she was there. She was heading the State Bank of Pakistan, the most powerful bank in Pakistan.
Well, exactly. So did the culture change in that bank? It'd be really interesting to see. I mean, we've had one of the CEOs of our largest bank, Westpac, which is one of our largest bank, first ever really female CEO, and the culture of the bank did change.
It did.
It did change. So flexible work, for example, became much more commonplace, so that both men and women could work flexibly and then also have caring responsibilities. So there were some really major shifts. And not only that, it had an impact on all the other banks as well. So I think, you know, that's the potential. And just on that, I mean, I've seen some really strong ministers as well who are looking not just at that top level of leadership, but I met with the minister who's running the income support just to hear about the great work that's happening.
Maiman.
Yeah, she was terrific. And, you know, just talking about the scale of what she was doing there, 5.4 million women who really, in her words, are the poorest of the poor. And so the ability then for them not just to have some additional funding, provided it's invested in wise ways, such as into the children and food and nutrition and all those things, but the ability for them to get a greater sense of themselves and to step up into education and work. That sounded remarkable, the work that's happening.
You've talked to the women parliamentarians as well here, to the female caucus. Do you feel, after having met them, having had their point of view, that Pakistan is a country where economic acceleration can happen with the help of gender equality and the women help and women empowerment?
Yeah, I absolutely believe that, because when you look at the greatest untapped resource in the world, it's women. And even if you're looking from an economic perspective. So McKinsey, their global institute, which does a lot of research, says if we had gender equality, it will add $12 trillion to the global GDP, the global economy. So, you know, it's a huge untapped resource. But having said that, it's not just about whipping women out of their families and into work, because caring work's the most important work any of us do, men and women, every day. So it's about allowing women, and I'd suggest men in the future, to both work and care. Because I always used to say, if there was only one thing I could do in Australia to promote gender equality, it would be the better sharing of paid and unpaid work between men and women. That would change our nation.
So do you see a future bright with women and men really working hand in hand and understanding and respecting each other's rights?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the world I want to, and you know, I hope I'm doing my very small part to create, but that's the world I want for my daughter and my son.
All right, when you leave Pakistan, do you feel that you leave with this positive frame of mind and this thinking that you'll come back again and work again in one aspect or the other to bring the women and men at par in this country?
Yeah, I'd love, I mean, I'm so excited about what I've seen and just the sharing of ideas. I mean, I can share male champions, but I'm seeing some great strategies, as I said before, here in Pakistan that I'll be able to take back to Australia as well. So I'm hoping that those connections will continue, and I'm hoping that our High Commissioner might see fit to ask me back.
And your High Commissioner is a woman as well.
Yeah, you can
so
love
you see,
that.
all for women empowerment and gender equality.
We're not all talk, we're action as well. So
let's hope this talk, this bringing into action, translates not only in countries of this region such as Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, but also in the West, where a lot of work still needs to be done despite all that has been done on the face of it, but in reality, to change that perspective, to change the mentality of the menfolk, as we say. I think organizations such as yours, such as the UN Women, and all that work that you're doing for changing the men's attitude towards women, bring its fruit in the coming years and decades. Thank you very much, Elizabeth Broderick, to have helped us understand what a true man should be all about and how he needs to treat women. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll end our show with this little comment that Elizabeth said that I found very interesting. She said, all the mindset change that needs to be brought within the menfolk and this gender equality, it's about evolution, it's not about revolution. Let's bring that evolution in our societies, whether it be in Asia, in Pakistan, or in the West, in Australia. Omar, Khalid, but bids you farewell from this episode of Diplomatic Enclave. We'll be back, inshallah, next week, same time, same channel. Take care of yourselves. Allah Hafiz. And Elizabeth, thank you so very much.
Thank you so much. Great. Really good.